be here. I am Chief Curator at the Eames Institute of Infinite Curiosity. I am also the youngest grandchild of Ray and Charles Eames, and it's wonderful to share about the work that they did because I still think it resonates with the work that we are doing today. This collection is something that my mother inherited after Ray passed away in 1988. Some of you might be familiar with this chair here. What I love sharing about this work is the fact that the questions that they were asking as they were designing this work. And the fact is most people know them for their furniture, but you can see also in the background some of the other materials beside molded plywood that they were working in. When my mother inherited this collection, she brought it to San Francisco, and then you might remember there was an earthquake in 1989, so she created space working with the architect William Turnbull, who did many buildings and beautiful structures at Sea Ranch, to create a space to be able to house the collection that she had inherited. Now, she thought it was 20,000 objects. It took 5 years and 7 people on the team that I work with. It's 40,000 objects. Now, what I love about it is it's not just furniture. You can see on the table in front there, my grandparents had relationships with IBM, Polaroid, Westinghouse, and so you can see in the work that we have here the different projects that they're working on. My grandparents were working in textiles, toys, furniture, exhibits, multi-screen presentations. Everything was about communicating an idea. That's what was important to them. So what we get to share is not just about what Ray and Charles made, but how they made it. And what I am hoping what you take away from today is really curiosity as a tool to approaching problems and opening doors to new ideas. Now, on this tabletop here, this is also reflecting the range of material in the collection. We have letters that Ray and Charles wrote to me. We also have some Herman Miller stock certificates, that little green one in the lower right corner. When Ray and Charles designed that stock certificate for this global company, what I loved is Ray asked for a bouquet of flowers to be picked from in front of the headquarters in Michigan. It was shipped to dry ice to Los Angeles. Ray made the bouquet, Charles took the picture, and then it's there in the blue on that stock certificate. And what it's really showing is something unique for this global company to be local. Those are only flowers that grew in that part of Michigan. But it's these details that I love in my grandparents' work. They were so intentional in everything that they were doing. Now, the role of the designer is that of a very thoughtful host anticipating the needs of his guests. Now, this idea first came for Charles when he was working with Eero Saarinen designing seating while they were both at Cranbrook. And while working on this project of designing chairs for a music hall, they asked themselves, what is the job of an architect? And what they came up with was this idea of being a very good host at a party and anticipating the needs of your guests before they've even thought of it. What I have found is Ray and Charles, as they also thought of this as the role of the designer, it's the role of any of us in the work that we do. When we are working with people, we need to anticipate what they will have to have and explain the choices and the constraints of what that project will be. Now, for Ray and Charles, this was an example of working with IBM. IBM had been asked to make a large donation in the 1950s to a new museum of science and industry down in Los Angeles, and IBM said, we'd much rather give you an exhibit by Ray and Charles Eames. Now, when my grandparents had done something they'd never done before, the first thing they did was go see what was already out there. So for Ray and Charles, they went across the country to look at science museums to see what the most popular exhibit was. And do you know what it was? It's when a baby chick is hatching out of an egg. So they said, whatever we design has to be more entertaining than a baby chick hatching out of an egg. The second thing they realized as they sort of did a deep dive in what was successful in exhibits was that you can't show everything. I can't even show you everything on my grandparents. It's impossible. But I can show you 9 or 10 things that might get you excited enough to learn more. And that was the point of the exhibit. And then there was one last thing. You want to excite the 10-year-old, but you don't want to embarrass the professional on the subject. So for Ray and Charles said it was very important is that you only share what you know. Now, for them, this is a diagram of their design process that they created in 1969 after 30 years of working together. This is for an exhibit in Paris. For those of you who might be familiar, there's a wonderful short film called Design Q&A. That's the curator who interviewed them and also curated this exhibit. Now, for this exhibit, the curator had asked all the designers and architects to share their design process. Now, most of them, I think, wrote back a few paragraphs, but Ray and Charles sent this. But it really does beautifully explain their process. The first circle is what they wanted to accomplish at the office. The second was their client. But there was always a third circle, society as a whole. And you had to focus on the part that overlapped for all three. Now, for Ray and Charles, that made a leg splint for the Navy in 1943. It was a way to help the war effort without hurting anybody. Working with Herman Miller, it was to make as sustainable a chair as you could possibly do, working with the constraints of fabrication of the time. If you're wanting to bridge a communication gap with Russia, you create a multi-screen presentation called Glimpses of the USA, which was in Moscow in 1959. Everything my grandparents did was about focusing on that overlapping part, the below part of the diagram here. Now, Charles passed away when I was 12, Ray when I was 22. Charles knew I wanted to be a sculptor before he passed away, so he told me, you need to be able to use every tool as well, if not better, than the person you hire, or you won't know if they're doing a good job. Now, the thing that I loved with my grandparents is, if somebody wasn't there that day, and to me, I consider it a relatively small office, especially the early years, about 12 to 14 people, they could take the picture, they could develop the film, they could help do the prototype. My grandparents never waited for anybody, and that was also important. They had great admiration for their friend Eero Saarinen, but when you're building a structure, you're waiting for the plumber, the mason, the everything. What they said about architecture with a chair, it's architecture you can hold in your hand. Now, Ray and Charles actually took this idea a little bit further. They like to give the example of when making chairs with Herman Miller, it actually had to be what's called goodness all the way down. It's 5 circles. It has to be good for the company, it has to be good for the person on the line actually making your piece of furniture, good for the designer, good for the community, and also good for the environment. That was what they needed to do. Now, I did hear Ray, when I was in college, speak about this diagram a few times. What I always liked that she said is it only is 5% of your energy to figure out the idea that goes in there. It's 95% of your energy to keep it in there, because it's so easy to go the path of least resistance. And so it was always checking in to make sure it was meeting all of these needs. This is an example of working with Herman Miller. I hope you're all surrounding yourselves with great partners, because Ray and Charles did themselves. Working with Herman Miller was very exciting. For Ray and Charles, part of that guest host relationship was to always make the best prototype possible before shipping it off to Herman Miller. Not only that, they often had to make the tools that made the prototypes, so they'd ship those things too. But they'd usually make the first 5,000. Now, even when something went into production, like the chair on the left, you'd think everything would have been worked out after 5,000. They start to notice that cloth edge starts to wear out. That's why it becomes the rubberized edge in the next version. Ray and Charles are also separating the upholstery from the frame to make it easier for you to reupholster if you so decide. Thinking of how a chair looks comes pretty far down the list of things I worry about when designing. I only think about how they look in relation to how they're doing their job. They must be comfortable for the kind of use they're going to get. If you think about the chairs that Ray and Charles designed, it might have started at the dining room table, but then the needs of an auditorium chair, it needs to be able to stack. For airport seating, you need to have good replacement parts. Each one had a different set of constraints. And for Ray and Charles, they really love to do a deep dive. And let me tell you, they talked to a lot of maintenance teams to learn what had gone wrong before. Now, at my mother's beautiful home in Petaluma, we decided to go off the grid. That's the project that we're doing right now. It'll take the next few years. We needed to move the collection. So we've moved it to Richmond, where I do give public tours and we do private retreats, but it's really exciting seeing everyone having a chance to see this collection. It's even more accessible being at Richmond now. And on the tour, we love sharing the combinations, the iterations, the prototypings that Ray and Charles were doing on their chairs, and also all the materials that Ray and Charles were working in. And in the lower left of this picture, you're going to see a white tabletop. That's one part of the collection. It might surprise you, the part of the collection that actually has the most various types of materials are the tables, because of the tabletops. because Ray and Charles are trying to find something that can handle hot, cold, and not scratch. So that one that you see there is actually Pyrex. Now, they couldn't mass produce Pyrex, but this was the prototype for the idea. We also have slate, marble, laminate, so many different materials. Now, the funny thing is the tabletops are not attached to the bases. So you can't just like take that off the shelf and use it. Although that particular table is a favorite of mine. Ray and Charles, I hadn't realized. I remember things as a granddaughter, but I also now see things as a curator today. I did my homework at that table. My grandparents had sent it to my mom, many pieces of furniture that I didn't realize were early iterations. That one's kind of a unicorn. So it's really fun to have it celebrated in the collection today. Also, another thing is when they were designing chairs, they actually called it designing seating. How they phrased the question was also important. And what I mean by that is they said, if you say you're designing a chair, you're already eliminating the ottoman before you've even thought of it. We've always been aware of not even attempting to solve the problem of how people should sit, but of rather arbitrarily accepting the way people do sit and of operating within that framework. This actually came from one of the first chairs that Ray and Charles designed when they were making the molded plywood chairs. And when they were making the shells, they were thinking about what bases should go with those. This is the 1940s. And Ray and Charles explore molded plywood, broad. Then they start looking at 4 legs, they start looking at 3 legs, and they start thinking about this. And they're quite excited about a 3-legged chair until they tested it. And then they found no one could get out of their 3-legged chair without falling. And they said, we're not going to teach anyone how to sit. We're just going to work with how people sit. And I appreciate, and nothing was ever called a failure. They would just say it's a misconception and move on with their lives. Now, I don't think these are all the slides. Wow. I got this. Well, there's so many stories to share about Ray and Charles. And I have 17 minutes, and I can even allow some questions. Well, one of my earliest favorite memories of spending time with my grandparents was going out to dinner with them. I thought everyone's grandparents did 3-screen slideshows and made movies like Powers of 10 for our visits. But for us, we were going out to dinner. We're walking back. If you know Venice, California, it's just about 3 blocks from Abbot Kinney. And we're walking back, and it was borscht, and I was 8 years old. I love borscht now. I hated it back then. So we're walking back, and Charles says, what did you think of dinner? And I looked at him, and I said, I didn't like it very much. Do you know what he said to me? Well, how would you have done things differently? What would you make with those borscht ingredients? And so we thought about it for about a block. We thought, oh, we could make mashed potatoes with the butter and the potato. We thought we could chop up the beets. I could put them on my brother's plate. We had this whole thing of how we were going to make borscht. So that took a block. Then the next block, Charles turns to me and he says, why was it borscht tonight? And then I said, was it all that was at the farmer's market? Was it somebody's favorite dish? Did they read about it in a magazine? So we had that whole story figured out by the time we got back to the office. Now, what I realized is I felt very empowered as an 8-year-old, and much later in my life did I realize that wasn't just a great design lesson, it was a great life lesson. Now, there was an Eames exhibit. It started in 2016 or 2015 at the Barbican in London, and it finished in Oakland Museum in 2019. And so when the docents came up to the ranch to have a tour, I could share the stories like I am right now. And so when the show opened, I went back to say hello to see how everybody was doing. And one of the docents came running over to me, and she said, Lisa, your borscht story worked. I said, great. How? And she said, well, the next time my grandchildren complained about their salads, I said, how would you do it differently? And she said, this was always a very tense moment at dinner, but she said it opened the door to a whole conversation that they'd not been able to have, and it turns out her grandchildren don't like raw mushrooms. And she's like, I could care less if they don't eat raw mushrooms. But by opening the door to having that conversation was very exciting, and so she just wanted to thank me for it. And these are the kinds of things that really, for Ray and Charles, thinking about learning by doing and also by being so hands in the material that they're working on, I think for Ray and Charles, what they were working on from the very beginning, when they worked on the molded plywood furniture, they it was important that they were hands-on. It was important that they were looking to see how something is made actually influences its design. So early on, they realized they had to make both the machines and the prototypes to make those early initial iterations of the design. When they got to about a few hundred, then as they were exploring this material, they would then start to think about how to scale it up. My grandparents never wanted to make a chair once. They wanted to figure out how to make a chair 100,000 times. Now, one thing that happens when you start to do that is an idiosyncrasy in a piece can be quite entertaining when it's once. But when you have to do it 100 or 1,000 times, you want to rip your hair out. Part of the reasons why there's 750,000 slides at the Library of Congress is because Ray and Charles used photography as a tool. Your eye's gonna lie to you, but the photograph won't. Now, Charles actually taught himself wet plate photography because his father had been a Pinkerton detective. And sadly, when his father was shot in a shootout, but did manage to get back to St. Louis, where he slowly died from wounds over a 2-year period, but he did write mysteries to support his wife and 2 children. Charles did learn about how his father had used photography in the work he'd done, and then Charles and Ray used photography in the work that they did. It was really an important tool for them in the whole body of work that they're doing. Now, also, when Ray and Charles are designing airport tandem seating, and they're asked to design seating for an airport, this is one of my favorites. They go to talk to the maintenance teams at different airports across the country to ask what their biggest problem is. I mean, you got airport seating, that's good. And then the maintenance team say, well, it's the replacement parts. And Ray and Charles are a little surprised, and they're like, well, what's wrong with the replacement parts? And they explained they were 2 different shapes, heavily upholstered, took up a lot of storage, took 3 or 4 people to pop out the old and put in the new. So what Ray and Charles did, and just imagine airport tandem seating is on the screen right now. Just imagine that they ended up making the back and the seat are the same shape. It takes 1 person and 1 screwdriver to pop out the old and put in the new, and the upholstery can roll up into a little tube and fit on the shelf and be easily stored. Those are the kinds of, I love the ways that Ray and Charles are always making things easier. I think part of the reason their work has lasted as long as it has is because they're just trying to make things easier as they go along. There's other examples I'm trying to think of off the top of my head. Let's see. For Ray and Charles also, when they designed exhibits like Mathematica I mentioned, they also, another one that I really love is the National Aquarium proposal. The National Aquarium proposal was in the 1960s. Ray and Charles were asked to create this in Washington, D.C. If you know D.C. is shaped like a diamond, it was going to be a diamond at the heart of the diamond. For Ray and Charles, this was an opportunity. Again, everything was about a need to address in the projects that they did, that overlapping interest. And even if you were Budweiser and asked them to redesign the bottle label, they looked at it for a few months, said it's doing everything it needs to, and gave it back. But the National Aquarium Project is the 1960s. For Ray and Charles, they're really excited about this. At that point, they are seeing the impact of mass production, not just of furniture, but across the country. And there's this wonderful quote called Lake Michigan's Dream, that everything's coming at the cost of the environment, and that's not sustainable, and that's not good. And therefore, the dream has to change. So for Ray and Charles, the reason they want to do a National Aquarium proposal is as a way, how do you get people to care about something they can't see, which is underwater? How do you make what's called the invisible visible? So for Ray and Charles, this may surprise you, they often started with themselves. When they did Mathematica, World of Numbers and Beyond, one of the graphics there is a magic square because they loved magic squares. Magic squares are when the columns and the rows add up to the same number. For National Aquarium, they thought about what they liked. And they realized they felt connected to what was underwater because of how beautifully each creature moves through the water. So they also know this is going to be politics in DC. So if you walk in with floor plans and a couple of pictures, most people are just going to look at it for a few minutes and then walk away. But if you create a short film for 8 to 10 minutes and put the seats a little too close together so no one wants to get up and accidentally step on someone's toes, you have an audience for 8 to 10 minutes to explain your concept. So Ray and Charles, to create that short film, had 20 saltwater tanks at the office. Do you know how much work that is? Like 1 tank is work, 20 is off the charts. They film the creatures for a few years. They create the short film. They get almost, but it doesn't quite pass. But then they created a booklet. It's called the National Aquarium Proposal. This then becomes the cornerstone of what will be the Monterey Bay Aquarium and also the Baltimore Aquarium. So another thing that I love is how these ideas live in different ways. And I don't think everybody knows, they might just know the furniture, but there's so much richness in this other material that they also are working in. Another thing that I would share is one of my favorite things in the collection is we have 220 toy boxes. Ray and Charles collected toys from all over the world. As they traveled more and more, they found 2 toys in every culture that they visited. Do you know what they were? Tops and kites. So do you know what they loved tops and kites so much? Because they're so well designed, you forgot they were designed. They're also not designed by one person. They're designed over generations. And what I found when you'd visit the office, that they would actually have often tops on the table or kites on the wall, because you know what it was? It was a great icebreaker. And they're starting to work with international partners. Everybody has touched a kite or flew a top or vice versa. Flew a kite and twisted a top. So, but what I love is it was always for my grandparents about bridging communication gaps and bringing people together, always looking for the similarities. When in 1958-59, they're working on Glimpses of the USA, which will be part of a cultural exchange with Russia in Moscow. They had a choice. They could polarize the situation or they could bring people together. And they chose to bring people together. So what they did is they actually did a 7-screen slideshow of showing the things that are same in both places. As they like to say, the need for this was to show our countries, our cities are much the same when viewed from the stars at night. So for Ray and Charles, you have mountains, we have mountains. You have cloverleaf patterns of traffic, we have it. You have people going to school. It goes on for 8 to 10 minutes. Now, what's interesting for Ray and Charles, they did many multi-screen presentations, and what they found is the hardest part is how to close it. You've had people's full attention for 8 to 10 minutes. How are you going to end it? They called it, what is the finial at the end of the staircase? So for Ray and Charles, they thought about it, were deciding what it should be for the closing, and they decided it would be the forget-me-not flower, which actually means the same thing in both countries, and it was a lovely way to say goodbye. Now, it was pretty funny that every time the State Department came by to see progress on the exhibit, you wouldn't believe it. All the projectors broke at once. And it happened twice. What are the odds? But they knew it might have probably gone into another direction, and for them, this was really an incredible opportunity to bring people together in that way. But I really wanted to really share, I hope you guys, right now we're getting ready for SF Design Week. We are having an exhibit of the last 10 years of furniture by Ray and Charles at the gallery over at the Transamerica building. Another thing that's been exciting, for those of you familiar with William Stout Architectural Bookstore, we've become stewards of the bookstore, and so it's just a couple of blocks away. We're gonna have some events around that. And soon on June 1st, we'll release the dates for the tours at Richmond, so I hope to see you all soon. And I'm happy to answer some questions. I have 6 minutes. Give me some questions. Yes?
If you had an autobiography, and you might, I'm sorry.
No.
What was the name of your autobiography?
Oh, I already know that. Saved. Because I work as an archivist and saving things, and also lets me think about the next context. I always love how one object can tell multiple stories, and that's part of what we're creating with the database that we are making for this collection of 40,000 objects. So you could do it one way. There are materials that Ray and Charles use in different ways, like the Saran fabric on the Eames Aluminum Group is used on the speaker for Stephen Trusonic. You could also just look at it in different ways. So for me, it's all about saving. So that's what I would do. Anybody else? Oh, come on. Yes, okay. Oh, good, we'll do one too.
Hi. What do you think about intellectual property and design given the age of AI and, you know?
I think, yeah. Well, having already gone through combinations, I think for us as a family, I mean, we want to make sure their designs are produced in the manner that they want to be. With knockoffs, what Ray and Charles would always talk about, if only they could improve it, not make it worse. I get frustrated because it simply is copying the silhouette, but not understanding that there's a huge amount of resources that we're putting into figuring out how best things are to be made. I think it needs to just have lots of conversations. I think, though, with so much curiosity and so much done digitally and physically, I'm in this wonderful world of analog in a very digital world. And I call it 3D printing before 3D printing. I call it Google before Google, because this is how my grandparents solved problems. And I feel like I would love to be part of these conversations, because I think we can learn something from my grandparents on this. I think there was someone over here. Yes.
Hey, how's it going? I'm really impressed you could just speak for 10 minutes without any slides there. You said one lesson which you learned as a grandkid. I'd be interested in other lessons that you've imparted to your kids that were kind of inspired by your grandparents.
Well, what's really fortunate is that my little family, my husband and 2 children, got to grow up next door to my mother, where we were archiving the collection. And I think one of the things that they love is my children, and something that we talk about is Ray and Charles didn't worry about not having the answer. They just asked a lot of questions. And they let all of their designs, every single one, come from the learning. And so for my children, and for me too, it's very, because it's, you look at some of these problems and it looks like utter chaos. And what Ray would say is just try to connect this, then you start to see that things start to come together. And so I find it very encouraging. And so I'm not worried about my kids, I'm worried about everyone else's kids. And so for me to get to be able to share this legacy in different ways and just make it, it's sort of like taking Ray and Charles off the pedestal and just showing how approachable they are. And also, there's only one time I'd ever see Ray and Charles angry or irritated. It's when someone would talk about an idea and just say, oh, I'm just going to jot this down on a napkin. And Ray and Charles were like, go do it. And the person would be like, I might fail. And you know what they'd say? Well, that will be one less misconception. And you move on. And so what I love is there's also, there is so much playfulness with my grandparents too. I mean, they were making films like Toccata for Toy Trains. They loved these beautiful Enzo Mari puzzles. Things didn't stay in the box. They would be using their short films and the tools that they were the toys that they were also creating. And so for me, that's one of the many elements that we are sharing at Richmond, online and also in person. So I hope you'll check out some of these ideas. Toys and play were really important to my grandparents too, and that's something else I like to share. So, anybody else? I still have 1.5 minutes. Not that I'm counting.
Just a conceptual question. A lot of the issues and design elements that you brought forth were problems brought to them saying, hey, use your curiosity and intelligence to solve this problem for us, the airports,
right.
Aquariums, et cetera. Were there passionate ideas that you either witnessed that were kind of their white whale as they were going through their careers, that they were like, I really want to do one of these when I have the time, resources, money, space? What were they passionate about solving problem-wise?
So on my grandfather's desk at the office, there was a stack of manila folders, at least yay high. And those were the projects that they didn't have time to get to yet. And I still remember walking into the office with my mom, and he takes the top one off. And do you know what it was? Sundance with Robert Redford in the 1970s, and they didn't have time to get that. There was a whole stack. What I love is also talking to former staff as a curator today. One of them, his name is Max Underwood, teaches at Arizona State University, and he describes this as if you finished a project early, you got to go to that stack and start working on a project until you were called to the next thing. And by the way, when you worked at the office, you needed to be very nimble. You might be working on a prototype, then a short film, then also a graphic. All of those are going on at the same time, and that was extraordinary. Now, what was interesting to me is he always said, Ray and Charles never came over to you to ask if you were done. You know what they'd ask? What did you find interesting? And on that note, I dropped the mic. Thank you.